Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
States. So help me God. Good evening, everybody. I've got a couple of questions for you before we get started. Is March 4th the actual inauguration day? Question number 2, who is the sovereign citizen movement? Do you have any idea who they are or what the actual inauguration day is? We're going to talk about those and solve this situation and get it straight. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Our Constitution in the News. I'm Mark David Smith. This report is titled March 4th versus September 20th, Setting It Straight. I used several internet articles for my research and base outline for this report, and I'll list them at the end of the report. And you can find the details of these references on MessianicLambNetwork.com. And now for my research on President and Vice President Inauguration Day, March 4th versus January 20th. Lord, we ask that our governmental leaders would be God-fearing and recognize that they are accountable to you for each decision and act. The 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution moved the beginning and ending of the terms of the president and vice president from March 4th to January 20th. The 20th Amendment was adopted on January 23rd, 1933. The part of the 20th Amendment that applies to our report states, and I quote, "The terms of the president and vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January." I find it interesting that this statement, the only statement in the entire Constitution to state an exact time and an exact date, is actually in the negative, as it states an end to the term and not the beginning of the term. I guess the beginning of each new term is assumed as apparent. It would seem that the only problem with the statement in the Constitution of these United States is if you believe it or not. So who doesn't believe this statement written in the Constitution of the United States? The sovereign citizen movement, that's who. The sovereign citizen movement believes that Americans are not subject to a variety of federal laws. They believe that a law enacted in 1871 secretly turned the United States into a corporation rather than a nation. They view every president inaugurated since this time as illegitimate. Members of the sovereign citizen movement believe that former President Ulysses S. Grant was the last legitimate president. President Grant, like other presidents in the 19th century, were inaugurated on March 4th, all except for George Washington. The sovereign citizen movement believes that the republic will be restored and Trump will become the United States 19th president on March 4th this year. So, once again, the only difference is whether or not you believe it or not. Sorry, redundant statement. At New York City's Federal Hall on March 4th, 1789, the Senate convened for the first time. From 1789 until 1933, when the Constitution's 20th Amendment changed the convening time to 12 noon on January 3rd. The date of March 4th would rank among the most important on the congressional calendar. Let's see. Let me take you back here a little bit. The state had convened for the first time, and they changed that from the same time to January 3rd. As the Constitution's framers had no way of knowing when the new Constitution would be approved, they directed the Congress under the aspiring Articles of Confederation to set the convening date in September 1788. Once the necessary 9 states had ratified, the Confederation Congress chose March 4th. It's not actually in there. They chose it as March 4th. I find it's reported in numerous articles that the Congress of the Confederation set March 4th as the date for commencing proceedings of the newly organized government. March 4th, it was the Constitution's first official day in business. The first modern Congress convened in New York City at Federal Hall. It was about 1 month before George Washington was elected as the first president under the new Constitution. But I have a copy of the Congress of the Confederation, and there is no mention of the setting of an inauguration date anywhere throughout the document. Both the Library of Congress and the White House show Washington was sworn in as the first U.S. president on April 30th, 1789. But he was inaugurated for his second term on March 4th, 1793, which the library says was the official date of inauguration at the time. Although Congress scheduled the first inauguration for March 4, 1789, they were unable to count the electoral ballots as early as anticipated. So the first inauguration for George Washington was postponed to allow the president-elect time to make the long trip from his home in Virginia to the nation's capital in New York City. The Library of Congress Index of Inaugurations shows most presidents for more than 100 years were inaugurated on March 4th. March 4th was established by Confederation Congress as Inauguration Day in order to allow enough time for Election Day, after Election Day, for officials to gather election returns and for newly elected candidates to travel to the Capitol, just like we just said with George Washington. It was established before the Constitution was written. The Confederation Congress that operated under the Articles of Confederation chose March 4th, 1789, as the date it would hand off powers to the new government established by the Constitution. So, the March 4th Inauguration Day was never written in any Articles of Confederation or Congress of the Confederation or the final Constitution of the United States. It was established and set in motion as the traditional day of inauguration by the Confederation Congress before the Constitution ever took effect. The problem was that there was too much time between Election Day and Inauguration Day. The long lame duck period might have been a practical necessity at the end of the 18th century when any newly elected official might require several months to put his affairs in order and then undertake an arduous journey from his home to the nation's capital. With modern advances in communication and transportation, the lengthy transition period proved unnecessary and legislatures pressed for change. From the early 19th century, it also meant a lame duck Congress. That's called what the people are. So that would be Congress in between the time that they were elected out of office and to the time that they were inaugurated into office is called a lame duck session. So when you say a lame duck Congress, it would be the Congress that was and is still performing its duties up until the time it has to step away for the new Congress. Same thing with the president and vice president. That's a lame duck session. So once again, from the early 19th century, it also meant a lame duck Congress and presidential administration would fail to adequately respond to a significant national crisis in a timely manner. The fact that the new Congress and presidential administration did not begin operation until April. March 4th was deemed to be the beginning of the newly elected officials' terms of office and thus of the end of the terms of their successors. The Constitution did not specify a date for federal elections, but by the time of the second presidential election in 1792, Congress had passed a law requiring presidential electors to be chosen during November or early December. By 1845, this was narrowing to a single day in early November. The result of these scheduling decisions was that there was a long 4-month lame duck period between the election and inauguration of the new president. Eventually, there would be an opportunity to cut down the length of that lame duck period with the improvement of technology in travel and counting. Along comes the 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment reduced the presidential transition and the lame duck period by which members of Congress and the president serve the remainder of their terms after an election. The amendment established congressional terms to begin before presidential terms, and that the incoming Congress, rather than the outgoing one, would hold a contingent election, and in the event that the Electoral College deadlocked regarding either the presidential or vice presidential elections. In 1921, President-elect Warren G. Harding set an inaugurational first by traveling to the Capitol for his inauguration in an automobile. It was just one sign of the changing times. With modern advances in communication and transportation, election officials and newly elected candidates no longer needed 4 months to gather election returns and travel to Washington. To minimize the transition period between Election Day and Inauguration Day and curtail lame duck Congresses, legislators introduced the 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution. On January 20th, 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the first U.S. president sworn into office in January. It was his second of 4 inaugurations. The first had been held 4 years earlier on March 4th, 1933. Since the 2020 elections, we've all heard countless stories about Trump in and out of office. Impeachment proceedings. I've even heard one the other day that said they were already starting secret proceedings to take Biden out of office and Trump would be sworn in on the actual real inauguration day, March 4th. Well, let me steer you in another direction and stop listening to that kind of thing. As we talked about earlier, there's groups all over that believe that the actual day is March 4th and that our government is not the right government that's in office. If it happens, it's just going to happen outside of everything else going on. Well, I just told the story, the whole story. March 4th was the accepted day of inauguration until 1933. The 20th Amendment to the actual Constitution of the United States says, as I quote, the terms of the president and vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January. There are no new amendments concerning this issue. Listen, if someone in some kind of authority that actually has some authority can prove the elections were miscounted and Trump did actually win, I'm sure they will set the record straight. Now, whether they'll put our President Trump, back in office, I haven't found that provision in the Constitution yet. Doesn't mean that it's not there. I just haven't seen it, and nobody that I know in any research that I've done can show me that they can't even put President Trump back in office on March 4th. So maybe other means, but not through the Constitution. By the way, Inauguration Day for the president and vice president is January 20th, following the election of the same. My main outline for this report came from 7 online sources. They are an article from wikipedia.org titled 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution, an article from the National Constitution Center titled On This Day, Government Begins Under Our Constitution, an article from King 5 News titled Answering Common Questions About Inauguration Day History. Also, an article from the Library of Congress titled Today in History, January 20th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Inauguration. Also, an article from the United States Senate titled The Significance of March 4th. Another article from the Library of Congress titled Today in History, March 4th, Inauguration Day. And lastly, an article from Financial Review, or AFR.com, titled Trump's D.C. Hotel Hikes Prices for Day QAnon thinks he'll be sworn in. Sorry, it threw me off there. You can find these links to these articles, find all the links on the MessianicLambNetwork.com website at MessianicLambNetwork.com or MessianicLambRadio.com. Thank you for joining, and please use the Messianic Lamb Network website for all your Messianic needs. There are over 1,400 Messianic videos, and that is climbing. As of today, we're growing close to 1,500 Messianic videos at the Lamb Network website. Messianic media for the Messianic lifestyle at www.messianiclambnetwork.com. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Our Constitution in the News. I'm Mark David Smith. Now, stay tuned for my research on Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 from the Constitution of these United States on Contemplating the Constitution. We'll be back right after this.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Don't you love it? Thank you for joining me on Contemplating the Constitution. I'm Mark David Smith. Last week, I gave you my research on Article 1, Section 10, Clause 2, called the Import-Export Clause. Lord, we ask that our governmental leaders would be God-fearing and recognize that they are accountable to you for each decision and act. This week, I give you my research on the last of the articles dealing with the legislative branch of the United States government in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 states, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. The first passage is more commonly called the States in Duty of Tonnage Clause. The second part is called the States in Military Affairs Clause. And the third part is called the Compacts Clause. If you're a longtime listener or follower of the show, you'll recognize that most of what I read, almost all of those items are somewhere in the past sections of Article 1. As we enter into the last section of Article 1, we notice that Section 10 makes sure all these past line items have been covered in full array. The first part of Clause 3 says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage in writing In writing the tonnage clause, the framers recognized that if the states had been left free to tax, the privilege of access to their harbors by vessels, the prohibition against duties on imports and exports in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 2 could have been nullified by taxing the vessels transporting the merchandise. The prohibition against tonnage duties embraces all taxes and duties, regardless of their name or form, whether measured by the tonnage of the vessel or not. In effect, these are charges for the privilege of entering, trading in, or lying in a port. The tonnage clause does not ban all taxes which fall on vessels that use a state's port, harbor, or other waterways. Such a radical proposition would transform the tonnage clause from one that protects vessels and their owners from discrimination by seaboard states to one that gives vessels preferential treatment with regard to all other property and its owners in a seaboard state. The tonnage clause does not extend to charges made by state authority, even if graduated according to tonnage for services rendered to the vessel, such as the action or business of piloting, towage, charges for loading and unloading cargoes, accommodations provided by a wharf for the loading or unloading, or storage. For the purpose of determining accommodation charges, it is immaterial whether the wharf was built by the state or a municipal corporation or an individual. A state may not levy a tonnage duty to defray the expenses of a quarantine system, but it may exact a fixed fee for examination of all vessels passing quarantine. A state license fee for ferrying on a navigable river is not a tonnage tax, but rather a proper exercise of the police power, and the fact that a vessel is enrolled under federal law does not exempt it. The second part of Clause 3 says, no state, without the consent of Congress, shall keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, known as the States and Military Affairs Clause. Concerning a state's military power, this provision contemplates the use of individual state military power to put down an armed insurrection too strong to be controlled by civil authority, and the organization and maintenance of an active state militia. This is not a keeping of troops in time of war within the prohibition of this clause. The third part of the clause says no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay, known as the Compact Clause. Except for the single limitation that the consent of Congress must be obtained, the original inherent sovereign rights of the states to make compacts with each other was not surrendered under the Constitution. The compact, as the Supreme Court has put it, adapts to our union of sovereign states. It is the age-old treaty-making power of independent sovereign nations. In American history, the compact technique can be tracked to the numerous controversies that arose over the ill-defined boundaries of the original colonies. These disputes were usually resolved by negotiation, with the resulting agreement subject to approval by the Crown. When the political ties with Britain were broken, the Articles of Confederation provided for appeal to Congress in all disputes between two or more states over boundaries or any cause whatever, but required the approval of Congress for any treaty confederation, or alliance to which a state should be a party. The framers of the Constitution went further. By the first clause of this section, the Import-Export Clause, they laid down an unqualified prohibition against any treaty, alliance, or confederation. And by the third clause, which is this one, the Tonnage Clause, they required the consent of Congress for any agreement or compact. The significance of this distinction was pointed out by Chief Justice Taney. He was the fifth Chief Justice of the United States, holding office from 1836 until 1864. He said, and I quote, "As these words, agreement and compact, could not have been idly or superfluously used by the framers of the Constitution, they cannot be construed to mean the same thing with the word treaty. They evidently mean something more and were designed to make the prohibition more comprehensive. The word agreement does not necessarily import any direct and express stipulation, nor is it necessary that it should be in writing. If there is a verbal understanding to which both parties have assented and upon which both are acting, it is an agreement." And the use of all these terms, treaty, agreement, and compact, show that it was the intention of the framers of the Constitution to use the broadest and most comprehensive terms, and that they anxiously desired to cut off all connection or communication between a state and a foreign power. We shall fail to execute that evident intention unless we give the word agreement its most extended signification. So apply it as to prohibit every agreement, written or verbal, formal or informal, positive or implied, by the mutual understanding of the parties, end quote. But more than 50 years later, in Virginia versus Tennessee, the court shifted position, holding that The unqualified prohibition of compacts and agreements between states without the consent of Congress did not apply to agreements concerning such minor matters as adjustments of boundaries, which have no tendency to increase the political powers of the contracting states or to encroach upon just supremacy of the United States. Accordingly, congressional approval of a compact is needed when the agreement might affect injuriously the interests of other states, or when the compact would infringe on the rights of the national government. For many years after the Constitution was adopted, boundary disputes continued to predominate as the subject matter of agreements among the states. Since the turn of the 20th century, however, the Interstate Compact has been used as an instrument for state cooperation in carrying out affirmative programs for solving common problems. So now let's take a look at the consent of Congress. I've mentioned it several times during my research, but of course it's right there in the actual clause that none of this can happen. And of course, what we're seeing here, all of these last, this section 10, clause 1, 2, and 3, all have to do with the states. And this one specifically talking about how the states have to deal not only with each other, but deal with the new Congress, the new government that's being set up, but how they cannot within themselves, by themselves, individually deal with foreign powers. It all has, all of that, whether you're dealing with other states or anything, it has to be through the consent of Congress. You have to, even your tariffs and your duties and all of that has to be run through Congress, and it has to be set up on a national basis. You can't, as any one state, have a jurisdiction or a better law or deal with people coming into your ports. You can't offer this even without all the states having equal ability to do this. So talking about the consent of Congress, the Constitution makes no provision with regard to the time when the consent of Congress shall be given, or the mode or form by which it shall be signified. While the consent will usually precede the compact or agreement, it may not be given until its nature is fully developed. The consent of Congress may be granted conditionally upon terms appropriate to the subject and bypassing no constitutional limitations. Congress does not, by giving its consent to a compact, relinquish or restrict any of its own powers. There you have my research on Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. Once again, like I said before, this is the last of the legislative procedures within the Constitution. And we will be going on to Article 2 next week. My base research comes from a couple of articles found on the internet. Number one is Wikipedia, titled Roger B. Taney. Then 3 articles are from Constitution Annotated website, titled States and Duty of Tonnage, the States and Military Affairs, and Compacts Clause. You can find the details of these references on the MessianicLambNetwork.com website. Next week, I'll give my research on Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1, which reads, "The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the Vice President, chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state shall be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. I'm Mark David Smith, and I'm your host for the Lamb Original show, Lamb Network Original show, Contemplating the Constitution. Thank you very much for joining me this week, and check out the Messianic Lamb Network website. We're pushing close to 1,500 videos now that are accessible through the website. And we're even putting together some new shows. So stay tuned as we plug on. We're here at the middle end of next month. We are going into our 9th year broadcasting through the Lamb Network. And so we're excited about that. We got a lot of things ahead for you, and doing some planning. So stay tuned. You're only going to find out through the website. So check back at the website often and see what we're going. There's even a page called New that will show you all the updated things. Anything new that we're bringing in, you're going to see it on this page. So there you go. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Contemplating the Constitution. I'm Mark David Smith. Have a great week.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.